Well, hey, we really do appreciate you all being here, and this is going to be a great presentation. And first things first here, our thanks to NHLA for allowing us to be here and to use this facility and be part of all of this, and we thank you to NHLA. But secondly, we thank you to Kuhn & Nagel, the freight forwarding company, that sponsored this and allowed us all to be here as well. So thanks to Kuhn & Nagel, they're a good group. All right, well, you're going to hear from Mike Snow, and Rupert Oliver is here from London. We also have some other AHEC staff here. Trip Pryor is here, of course, from our Washington office, and then Luis from Mexico, David Venables from London as well. And who did I miss? Well, John Chan's around here too. I haven't seen him yet, but he'll be here. So we really appreciate you all being here, and there's good things that you're going to learn about. And especially at the end of this, you're going to learn about a new opportunity that we think is going to help the whole industry nationwide. So without further ado, Mike, it's all yours.
Thanks, Dave. We're going to do something a little bit different than normal. I am going to go through the markets and talk a little bit about what's going on in some of the overseas markets. The data that you're going to see is all first 6 months of the year, so it's going to look fantastic. Unfortunately, the second 6 months I don't think is going to be anywhere near that. But what we're going to end up, we're going to be talking about the goalposts are changing on us in a number of markets, particularly in Europe, when it comes to anti-deforestation regulations, when it comes to demand for certified timber moving forward, and we think there is an opportunity that Europe has opened up, and I'll talk a little bit about this when I get towards the end, when I start talking about Europe before Rupert comes up. But we think there's a real opportunity to develop specifically for our industry, for low intensity, small forest, small sawmills, to essentially to create a certification system that actually works for small non-industrial operators. It's working now in things like wood pellets. The soybean industry just passed something very similar that the European governments are accepting. We think there's a real possibility now, and the time is right, and we've been doing some work for about the last 18 months or so, some groundwork, and Rupert's going to talk about that. But before we do, I will begin with a little bit of a kind of big picture. The U.S. is, and we still remain, the largest hardwood exporter in the world. These are the numbers from the end of I'll go backwards. Well, those are the numbers from the end of 2021. You notice that global trade was down quite a bit from 2019. The next numbers you're going to see now, these are 6-month 2022 numbers. So you can see where we did see significant growth over the last 2 years, 21 and then into 22, the first 6 months. Lumber has increased pretty substantially. Logs are also growing, and the veneer's growing a little bit as well. But the lumber markets for the first half of the year have actually been very, very good overseas. If we look at where our lumber is going, not a lot of change, but you'll notice how much the pre-trade war or the pre-Chinese decline, because not necessarily just the trade war, you'll notice how much less our exports are overall than they were just a couple of years ago. You notice China is and still remains the largest market that we have. Other than that, Canada, of course, comes in at number 2. Then the European Union, taken together with the UK, is the 3rd, followed by, Mexico? Vietnam, and then Mexico. So to look at what's going on around the world, this is something that economists use, and it looks a little bit confusing, but this is called the Purchasing Managers Index, which is really an index of everything from energy use to machinery purchases and so forth. And the main thing to look at is the number 50 here, because anything over, I keep hitting the wrong button, anything over 50 means the economy, means that production, that manufacturing is increasing. Anything under 50 means that manufacturing is declining. So right now, we look globally, we're starting to see, we saw a good beginning of the year, but we're starting to see as we get into the second half of 2022, we're starting to see on a global basis, and we'll talk about individual countries in just a moment. Thank you for that, for fixing that. So let's take a look first at Greater China, our biggest market. We did see a little bit of growth this year. You see volume was up the first 6 months by about 7%. Value was up by about 20%. I think we're all aware of what earlier in the year what prices were looking like. But you'll notice that with China, we're looking at essentially about half the volume that we had pre-trade war. And when we look in a second, you'll see it's not necessarily just the trade war. The Chinese market is changing. The Chinese market is changing very, very quickly, and it's changing, I don't think, for the better, and I think they're going to be in for a very rough ride for the next couple of years. If we look at on a species basis, this is one of the issues, of course, that we always face. Back in 2017, 2018, China was buying about 80% of all of our red oak exports. So by losing those red oak exports to China, that really created a problem because obviously that's one of the most abundant species that we have in the forest. We're starting to see, we've spent a lot of time at AHEC pushing red oak into other markets that traditionally haven't bought a lot of red oak, places like Europe, places like Australia, places like Japan. We are starting to see those markets pick up on red oak, which I'll talk about in a minute. But again, you'll notice the volume of red oak from back pre-trade war to China to down to where we are right now, and we're looking at a loss of about half of that market. But it's important to keep in mind it's not just a question of the trade war, because if you look at China's imports overall of hardwood from all sources, not just the US, that's down about 35, almost 40% from where it was back in 2018. The US, we were, back in 2017, we were the largest supplier to China. We had about 30% of the market share, followed closely by Thailand. That's now switched. We're now the second. We have a smaller piece of a much smaller pie in China. And that pie, I'm afraid, is going to get smaller in the near future as well. A lot of what's happening in China, a lot of China's wounds are self-inflicted. We've seen Xi Jinping over the last couple of years make it abundantly clear that he's more than willing to sacrifice economic growth for what he views as geopolitical advantage or geopolitical power. He's cracked down considerably on private companies, which actually drove China's growth for most of the last 20 years. They're being starved of capital right now. He's doubling down on state-owned enterprises that are, in most cases, woefully inefficient, but they're absorbing the lion's share of the available credit in the Chinese market right now. And the regulations that he's been putting on private industry in China, I think, has been very worrying to a lot of people, and that's leading to, we'll talk a little bit about nearshoring and offshoring and so forth, because he's been cracking down on private companies because he's afraid that too many of them were getting too big and getting too powerful. I know a lot of you know about Jack Ma and Alibaba, and essentially they've been regulated out of existence. But from our perspective, I think one of the most concerning things that's going on in China right now has been a very, very rapid slowdown of the construction industry. Not only homes, this is home sales, but also commercial real estate. And this is a real problem for the Chinese economy because local and state governments in China essentially get their money, not through taxes by and large, but through selling land for development. The Chinese housing market for about most of the last 20 years, has been growing very, very quickly. But if you really look at it, it's essentially been a giant Ponzi scheme where you pay up to 20 or 30% in advance for a home, and you begin paying mortgage before they even begin construction on your home. And what's been happening now in China is that you all heard about the Evergrande. They've defaulted. One of the biggest property developers in the world have now defaulted on their debt. China's been taking the money that I paid last year for my house to start to be built, to build his house. And then next year, somebody's going to pay in, and they're going to use his money to build my house. And like all Ponzi schemes, that works great as long as there's always money coming in at the far end. And right now, there's not. And in fact, there's almost 20 million people right now in China that are actually boycotting their mortgage. And it's creating some tremendous problems in China. If we look at home sales, this is the red line here. I don't know if there's more people, I think that's on this half of the room. If you notice the home sales in China, property sales, way down, particularly in the last 9 months. But China's got some other issues to deal with too, and that's part of it is going to be they're overstretched on, I don't know if you know about the Belt and Road Initiative, which was supposed to be China's Marshall Plan. It was their way of really building bridges with the third world. They spent billions and billions of dollars on infrastructure around the world. Now a lot of these third world countries are having trouble paying that money back. We've already seen Sri Lanka has defaulted on their Belt and Road loans from China, and essentially China turned around and took the port that they had built for Sri Lanka. As you can imagine, it doesn't make the Indians very happy. The Chinese now essentially have a naval base just off the coast of India. And they're not the only ones. We think Pakistan is about to default on their loan to China. Congo is about to default on their loans to China, on their loans from China, their Belt and Road loans. And again, this is putting tremendous strain on the Chinese financial system as well at a time when global economy is not growing at all. And then we still have the specter of the tariff war hanging over us. As of now, the tariffs have been lifted on our products through the end of November of this year, so about another 2 months. What's going to happen after that is anyone's guess. I think if things remain relatively quiet, which they seem to remain relatively quiet, I think we'll see quietly. We'll find out on the 30th that they're going to extend it. But there is every possibility that they decide that they're going to replace the tariff. So it's something that we do need to keep in mind because we just have no way of knowing in advance. And there's very little discussion coming out of China. And I think John may have a better idea, but I think it's probably 50-50 whether or not they're going to put the tariffs back on or they're going to keep them off. But it's, again, an awful lot's going on in China. They're having their next party Congress is coming up in November as well. They don't want to rock the boat. And, of course, we know that they've handled COVID about as badly as COVID can be handled. And that's creating, again, an additional layer of havoc to the Chinese economy. This has been leading a lot, not only with China, but also in what we're seeing with Russia with the invasion of Ukraine, and the supply chain issues that we've had recently is really leading a lot of companies, I'm sure you're very well aware of, to really kind of look at their supply chains, look at where they're manufacturing, look where their imports are coming from, and we're seeing two kind of parallel movements. One of them, either nearshoring or friendshoring. Nearshoring is coming back closer to the end market. We know the United States for China has always been one of the largest end markets for all of its exports. But friendshoring is more, we've seen what happens with Russia, where if there are political problems, if there are political issues, then all of a sudden your supply chains can be cut off overnight. So we're starting to see a movement from a lot of companies that are beginning to invest more in what they're considering friendly countries that are less likely to have these types of sanctions or these types of ability to cut off access to materials. But it's not just that. Part of it also is manufacturing costs. China's really no longer the low-cost manufacturer. If we look at hourly wages in coastal China, they're significantly above both Mexico and Vietnam. So there's all of these different sources of disruption are all happening at the same time, and that's creating really tremendous disturbance in the Chinese market. But that's creating opportunities for others. We're starting to see a lot of companies shift production, Asian companies, Korean companies, Japanese companies, Taiwanese companies shifting production from China to Vietnam. We're also seeing a lot of companies that are shifting their production into Mexico, and we're beginning to see more and more, and I'll talk about that in a second when I talk about Mexico and when I talk about Latin America. We're starting to see more and more companies looking at that. I was surprised a couple weeks ago. I was with Luis down in the Tecnomueble show in Guadalajara, which is the biggest furniture show in Mexico. For the first time ever, the Malaysian Timber Council had a booth there, so they're looking now at that market very seriously. We saw a few Taiwanese companies walking around, inquiring about resources. I think we're going to start to see, more furniture manufactured in Mexico, but I'll talk about that in a second. So if we look outside of China, really the next biggest markets are obviously Vietnam. We're looking at individual countries now. Vietnam is next, followed by Mexico, then the UK, and you notice this nice big jump in the UK. And this is actually very, very interesting because out of all the European countries, the UK is really one that doesn't have a major industrial woodworking industry. You know, you've got the big furniture manufacturers in Italy, you've got the flooring manufacturers, you've got the door guys in Spain that have, you know, kind of large. The UK economy, basically our imports there, are all going to these small, essentially small manufacturers, you know, bespoke furniture manufacturers that are making just a few here or there, and they're driving a lot of quantity of wood going in. And then you see Japan, then Germany, Italy, and down the line, a lot of European countries in there, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's look at Southeast Asia. When we talk about Southeast Asia, of course, we're talking primarily about Vietnam. This is through the end of 2021. You notice the green is Vietnam. We saw a nice jump both in 2020 and 2021 into Vietnam. We're actually back to pretty close to where we were 3 years ago in Vietnam, but that's starting to slow down now as well. This was through June. So if we look at through June right now in Vietnam, we've actually got volume down by about 10% into Vietnam, but the value of the exports to Vietnam are up by about 9%. And actually, what's kind of interesting about this is that's not necessarily just about higher lumber prices, but the Vietnamese furniture industry is actually moving higher up the value-added chain. They're starting to do more expensive furniture, and as a result, they're starting to change the species mix a little bit. So it's not just the change in lumber prices that are leading to the higher values, even with volumes going down. It's because the species mix is changing. A few years ago, it was, in 2017, almost 60% was yellow poplar. I'm sorry, David, tulip wood that went into Vietnam. Now we're seeing a lot more white oak. We're seeing a lot more red oak. We're seeing, alder. We're seeing things like walnut. So the Vietnamese furniture industry is beginning to move up the value chain a little bit. They're realizing that they can't necessarily continue to compete at the low end of the market, and I think they're making some prudent choices to start moving up the value chain, and we're starting to see some of that lower end furniture go to places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and we have seen significant growth. Again, this is through the first half of this year. Much smaller, obviously, overall numbers than what we see in Vietnam. But if you look at Indonesia, Thailand, we're starting to see more and more, and they're starting to get into the lower end of that market that Vietnam is kind of moving out of and moving into the higher end of the market. Mexico, Latin America, I would say Mexico, similar to Vietnam, when we talk about Latin America, essentially we're talking about Mexico. This is through 2021. Mexico's the purple. All the rest of Central, South America, and the Caribbean is this little part up here. So again, when we talk Latin America, we're essentially talking about Mexico. Through the first 6 months of this year, again, we've seen now the last couple of years, we've seen significant growth in Mexico, a lot of interest, and Luis is here, I mean, talk about it a little bit later, what's driving that, but again, this whole nearshoring, friendshoring, I think is driving a lot of that, and I think we're likely to see that increase. In fact, Mexico is probably the country that has benefited the most from the trade friction between the US and China. We're seeing a lot of investment now going into Mexico for things that previously were manufactured in China, and I think Mexico is really kind of poised to really take off for us. It's a big market now, but I really do think the future for our ability or for our sales in Mexico, I think, are very bright. Again, the first 6 months of this year, we've seen both volume and value are up to Mexico again. Which is good considering the economy is slowing down, but I don't think we're going to see anything similar in the second half of the year, and that goes back when we look at the PMI for Mexico. Right now, after being fairly strong, they suffered greatly during, like everybody else did during the COVID, but after popping up well above 50 for a while, they've now just in the last 2 months, they've now dropped below 50, which means industrial activity is actually slowing down in Mexico and not increasing. But I think that's bound to be a short-term issue until things like energy prices and inflation and all of that kind of work its way through the system. Northeast Asia and Oceania, and the biggest countries there, of course, Japan is largest, still remains one of the largest markets as far as unit value, the Japanese market. We are starting to see a little bit of changes in species. It's always been very, very heavily into white oak. We're starting to see a little bit more. We're starting to see things like hickory coming into the Japanese market. We're starting to see more and more red oak into the Japanese market. Seen a little uptick in South Korea as well. So if we look at the first half of this year of 2022, again, we've seen a very, very nice jump in Japan. But again, the Japanese economy is beginning to slow down like everyone else. The inflation rate in Japan, I think, actually hit about 7% now, which is unheard of in Japan. And obviously, a lot of that is being driven by energy prices. So again, looks good now. That's the first half of the year. I don't think we're going to see this kind of growth continue in the second half of the year. We look at Australia and New Zealand. Very, very good growth last year in 21. So far, the first 6 months of this year, we've seen actually a drop-off, particularly to Australia. And again, the Australian economy, like the rest, is contracting and is suffering through high energy prices and high inflation. If you look at the rest of the emerging markets, we've got a lot of interesting things. When we look at the Middle East, you've really got kind of a dichotomy. You've got two different things going on. You've got the oil-producing countries, the Saudi Arabia, that are doing just fine right now. You're starting to see a lot of building going on, of course, with energy prices where they are, with oil prices where they've been. Those economies are flush with cash. The other end of the spectrum, you have places like the Emirates, Dubai, and so forth that are dependent on tourism for a lot of their income, hospitality industry for a lot of their wood use, and those countries are suffering right now as well, like everyone else is. Pakistan, which has always been one of the best, one of the biggest markets in the Middle East for us, they're having all kinds of problems. Not only are they about to default on their loan back to China, but about a third of the country right now is underwater, although it's beginning to recede a little bit. But this is really stopped. It's closed a lot of the ports. It's closed a lot of the inland transport in Pakistan. So I think we're going to see the second half of the year, beginning in about August, we're going to see a real steep decline in exports to Pakistan. Very, very interesting one is Turkey, which continues to increase. We saw a nice jump, about 12 or 13% by volume going into Turkey through the first 6 months of this year. And when you look at what's going on with the rest of the economy, it's kind of surprising. This was, as of July, the official inflation rate, about 80% in Turkey. I think the real inflation rate is closer to about 120% right now in Turkey. At the same time, in Turkey, you've had the lira absolutely collapse. It's lost 40% of its value against the dollar. The reason that we're still able to get things in there is really based on the re-export markets. A lot of it is TMT. As you know, there's a big thermal modification company in Turkey that buys a lot of volume of lumber. But things that are being manufactured, like furniture, and then sold back out, really aren't hit as bad. In fact, it makes the cost of labor much lower. So they're able to, particularly in the re-exports, despite all of the bad economic news in Turkey, it's actually remained a fairly buoyant market for us in the last couple of years. India is the next one that we keep talking about. There is tremendous potential there. India is one of the few countries in the world right now that we're seeing actually the PMI well above 50. We're seeing economic activity continue to grow. They've been able to take advantage of essentially deep discounts in Russian oil. That's driving down a lot of their prices. And again, they're searching for new sources of supply. A lot of their traditional sources of supply of timber are either on CITES lists or essentially are gone. So there is some interest there, and we're seeing growth that's been pretty spectacular actually in the last year. If you notice the jump from 2020 to 2021, it was up. Our sales to India were about 400% up. Now that looks a lot more impressive until you look at the actual numbers and the volume. We're talking about a 400% increase in a pretty small market for us. In fact, the U.S. right now, we went from 1% market share in 2019 to 3% market share through the first 6 months of 2022. So there's a lot of upward mobility for us. I'd mentioned before, the UK, you don't consider the UK a major lumber export country, but they actually export about 4 times as much lumber, willow, to India than the United States, the world's largest exporter, does. So there's clearly a lot of room for growth. I know it's a difficult place to do business, but again, we saw that 400% jump last year, and we're seeing a similar jump, not anywhere near the same scale right now, but we are seeing continued increases, and we're seeing even past June, I think to July, we were still up into India. So it's one of the few economies that is weathering a lot of this quite well and is continuing to grow. So again, if we look at the first 6 months of 2022, we don't have anywhere near the huge jump that we had from 2020 to 2021, but again, it is moving in the right direction. I'm going to end with Europe. As you know, a lot of the, when we looked at those top 10 countries, about 6 of them were European countries. The European PMI, after being pretty positive for much of 2021, late 21, and into 2022, is now beginning to fall below that 50. And I think once we get the new one, this is from July, I think once we see the August numbers, let alone the September numbers, we're going to see that PMI decline, and we're going to see the economy slow way down. I think it's going to be a rough winter for David and Rupert and energy prices and things in Europe. And when people are struggling to heat their homes, I don't think we're going to see a lot of furniture sales and new flooring and new renovations projects going on in Europe. If we look at country by country, again, I talked about before, the UK is by far the largest market in Europe. No longer part of the EU, of course, but it is still the largest market that we have in Europe. And that's a big change. It wasn't that long ago when Spain was the largest market anywhere for U.S. hardwoods. But the UK, as I said, continues to grow, and I think it kind of defies, I don't want to say defies logic, but it really is driven by a lot of very small operators. We started looking at red oak. We talked about all the red oak sales that we had lost to China. We're starting to scratch some of those back slowly but surely in places like Europe. We've spent a lot of time and energy from AHEC pushing red oak. We're starting to see it. It is beginning to move, and I think what the point that David makes is that we're actually seeing red oak not necessarily replacing white oak, but being an additional species, an additional source going into Europe. And this is kind of a different way to look at the same information. Of course, the big thing going on right now in Europe is the war between Russia and Ukraine, and people don't realize those are 2 of the largest exporters of hardwoods in the world. And both of them have been taken pretty much out of the game right now. But beyond that, we look at where Russia's exports went. Yes, China is the biggest market for Russia like it was everywhere else, and by and large, they're still selling into Russia. But if you look at some of the other countries in there, those are countries that have put bans on imports from Russia. So you're looking at countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland. Those countries have all pretty much stopped importing from Russia. So again, that is helping us as well, I think, to create some additional opportunities, at least at the margins, in Europe. But just as important, between the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself, is about 1/3 of all certified hardwoods to PEFC and FSC in the world. And essentially, all of that certified material has been taken off the market as conflict timber now. So none of that can be sold as certified. And that, of course, is creating some real holes in Europe as well. And that's happening at the same time that Europe has just passed, well, it still needs to be reconciled, but the part of this law that's bad for us is in both versions that need to be reconciled. And essentially, what the European anti-deforestation regulation is going to require is, if it doesn't change between now and then, is that all products, whether it's wood or agricultural products or anything that has the potential to cause deforestation, palm oil, soybeans, it has to be now accompanied by a geolocation for where every piece of wood came from, down to the individual landowner. Now, obviously, that's going to be a real problem, particularly for the United States. That's going to be a real problem if that doesn't get changed. And it's going to be a boon for places like Russia, where a lot of the wood is owned by the state. So there is one landowner. So their geolocation just has to be Russia, essentially. So we're looking at really what's going to be an uneven playing field. But we think there's an opportunity not only to solve this one directly, but looking at what is happening with demand for certified timber around the world. We know in the U.S., we know the issues with the with the small forest management unit certification systems that currently exist. They've been talking for decades about reaching out to the small landowners, about group certification and all this. Nothing's ever happened, and I don't see it happening, but we do think there's a real opportunity now through what's called a jurisdictional certification. And this is what they're using for things like soybeans. This is what the Europeans are already accepting for things like wood pellets coming out of the same forests that our hardwood lumber comes from, yet they'll accept non-certified or wood pellets certified to a jurisdictional program. And we kind of took a look at that and looked at how we could adapt that type of jurisdictional certification system that not only Europe is accepting for certain products. There's no reason they shouldn't be accepting it for ours as well. And we're starting to put that together, but it's also important to keep in mind that this goes beyond Europe. If you look at the Turkish furniture manufacturers, the Indian furniture manufacturers, the Vietnamese, the Chinese that are selling wood furniture back into Europe are going to have to jump through the same holes and show where through the same hoops and show where their timber is coming from. We think there's a real opportunity to create a jurisdictional certification system for American hardwoods that works for small non-industrial landowners. And as I said, we spent about the last year and a half working with some of the people that originally set up FSC and the system in the first place that have now become disillusioned with it for a variety of reasons. And we've spent about the last year to a year and a half putting together what we think could be a very, very workable system for our industry. And I'm going to let Rupert talk to you about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I'm going to quickly run through this certification program. So please don't leave the room, because it wasn't my favorite subject until quite recently, certification, but I'm telling you now it has become so again, because I think there's some real policy changes, some real changes in the way that people think about certification and about things like risk assessment and due diligence, which really is beginning to work in favor of American hardwoods and the sort of sector that we're working in. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. What I'm going to introduce to you is this idea. It's a Sustainable Hardwood Coalition. We're putting together a coalition in support of a new form of sustainable hardwood certification. And the aim, as stated on the slide there, is to develop a cost-effective system. That's pretty important. It has to be cost-effective to verify the sustainability of hardwoods and maximize market opportunities for sustainable hardwood products. We've got a very unique focus in this certification system on delivery of a sustainability claim which exploits the distinct and inherent sustainability characteristics of durable and diverse hardwood products from small non-industrial forest operations. It has to be zero cost for individual forest operators. That's something that's pretty key. Whenever a system's developed in which individual small forest operators have to sign into it, it can't reach scale. I mean, that's been proved over and over again. It simply can't reach scale. So we have to find a new way of certifying these operators at scale. It also has to be minimal cost to individual mills. That's very critically important. And what we're offering should be at an acceptable cost, we think, because it will allow you to certify your entire mill production as sustainable. You won't have to go to a lot of expense to implement mitigation measures, for example, just to supply a very small proportion of your output as sustainable. We want hardwood certification at scale in regions, of course, where there's fragmented forest ownership. We're building on, as Mike said, an accumulating wealth of experience of jurisdictional risk assessment, and we're responding directly to the existing policy focus, which internationally now is focusing very much more on forest governance issues at a national and jurisdictional level, on due diligence approaches to demonstrating conformance to standards and regulations, and also, of course, zero carbon. And with zero carbon requirements increasingly being imposed in different countries, the need to verify your carbon content using proper data, good quality data, is becoming increasingly important. There is a big problem with existing systems of certification at forest management unit level, because you need quite a lot of technical capacity on the ground. You need a lot of certifiers. And when you've got a lot of fragmented forest ownerships, there simply isn't the number of certifiers to offer that service at scale in many of these countries, the US being a prime example. And we need, of course, to meet all the criteria of formal procurement policies. I mean, I'm talking here about public procurement policies in Western governments that have implemented green building codes, for example, retailers' procurement policies. And we need to respond to consumer demand for a simple and universally understood message that this hardwood is sustainable, and making maximum use of new technology in support of these goals. So why are we doing it now? Why do we think this is needed now? Well, we have been looking in some detail at the actual markets for certified wood products in our major markets. We undertook a survey early last year covering 20 major US hardwood importers in the EU, in the UK, and Australia. And everywhere it was pretty clear. Everyone had pretty good perception, in fact, of American hardwood's environmental credentials. No doubt about it. The message that's been going out for the last 20, 30 years about American hardwoods, the strong narrative of good environmental performance has certainly got out there. But there is a very strong tick box mentality in many of the markets that we are finding that we're constrained in. There's a focus very much on specific forms of certification. They want FSC. If they can't get FSC, they'll go elsewhere. They won't even ask the question about the stronger environmental narrative behind American hardwoods. In the UK, the analysis indicated that from the response we got from the survey there, that we could in fact increase our exports to the UK by quite a significant amount, by 25% to 50%. At the time we did the survey, that was $20 million to $40 million of extra trade. If certified wood was more widely available, it would mean that US hardwoods would be better placed to take share, particularly from European hardwoods and to some extent from tropical hardwoods, which incidentally are also getting certified already. John Lewis Partnership, we've been having quite close conversations with that, a big, well-influential retailer in the UK. They're already requiring 100% responsible timber sources or sustainable. And we're having regular meetings with them, and they've shown quite a lot of support for this new idea, because they're, like a lot of retailers, they're concerned. You know, they made these commitments to FSC certified wood, but they simply can't get the material supplies. So a lot of them increasingly are looking for alternative mechanisms. Van der Kasteel, be familiar to a lot of you. It's Belgium. It's the EU's largest hardwood importing company. And they have had a big campaign, promotional campaign, saying that they will only buy certified wood from 2025. So again, does that mean they're going to stop stocking American hardwoods? Well, it shouldn't do. That's why we need some sort of mechanism to help them meet that target while also ensuring that they can still buy American hardwoods. And Bunnings, yes, just looking at Australia, the country's largest DIY retailer, they've wanted 100% certified wood since 2020. So in that particular market in Australia, there is quite a significant barrier. But elsewhere, has to be said, elsewhere in Europe, importers were generally less inclined to attribute their loss of market share to certification. The focus of certification markets tended to be lost sales to specific large retailers, to large public projects, to projects covered by green building initiatives, for example. That was where share could be gained for American hardwoods with increased certification. And of course, we were asking people who generally are quite bought into the idea of buying US hardwoods. We were mainly talking to existing US hardwood importers, and I think that's quite a biased sample, in fact. There's several markets that we're familiar with, the Netherlands, for example, France, where the importers there have quite strict policies of trying to move to certified wood very quickly, And in those markets, we're exporting only quite small quantities of US hardwood to those markets. And to a large extent, that is down to the fact that we can't offer them certified sustainable timber. There's a few surveys that have been done recently. I'm not going to go into detail about these, but they have demonstrated quite clearly that the trade generally is moving towards certification increasingly in response to the EU timber regulation. Most public procurement policies at national level across the EU are already preferring FSC or PEFC certified wood. And the 20 largest market-leading timber companies in the EU and the UK, there was a survey of them, 20 companies were surveyed. Of those, 19 have a green purchasing policy, and 16 stating quite clearly that they have a preference for PEFC or FSC certified products. Mike's already mentioned the draft EU deforestation legislation. And actually, this is the sort of legislation that should really be really positive for a product like American hardwoods. It identifies agricultural commodities as the major drivers of deforestation worldwide. It even included in the original draft a definition of sustainable forest management that looked very much like the sort of forest management that happens in the US. But of course, all that good work was undone by this one requirement for geolocation, which, as defined in the current draft, will be an extraordinarily significant barrier to US trade. And I have to say, it does look like this requirement for geolocation will go through. It looks very likely that it will go through, and that would be implemented from the 1st of January 2024. And if we're going to avoid that becoming a barrier, we have to offer them some sort of alternative, a better procedure for demonstrating that there's no risk of deforestation, there's no risk of illegal practices. So in a sense, we do need this system in order to avoid external imposition of what I've put down there, unnecessary, ineffective, and inoperable procedures, because that is what they're heading towards at the moment. But actually, underlying all this, I've talked a lot about barriers, underlying all this, it's actually more about opportunities. With policy shifts, there's big policy shifts towards, as I say, forest governance, zero carbon, zero deforestation. There's focus increasingly for the carbon mitigation reasons. A lot of interest now in low-intensity forest management. Policymakers everywhere are beginning to think in terms of how important it is to recognize the rights of forest dwellers and how important it is that forest management, sustainable forest management, really does genuinely benefit the people who are living in those forests. And there is increased awareness now of the constraints to forest management unit certification systems like FSC and PEFC, which can work very well in certain contexts. They just do not work very well when you're dealing with lots of non-industrial forest owners. There's opportunities from these new forms of verification, risk-based verification, jurisdictional certification, which are becoming increasingly recognized for other commodities now. And there's lots of opportunities from new technologies. We need to exploit these new technologies more effectively in demonstrating conformance to sustainability procurement policies. Things like remote sensing, which make risk-based approaches much more effective, much more credible, stable isotope ratio analysis, DNA footprinting, blockchain. All these technologies could be integrated more effectively into the supply chain. I mean, they could be utilized for demonstrating and communicating positive messages about the sustainability of American hardwood products. And we could, by engaging in certification in a realistic way, looking at new procedures, we could change the whole conversation around certification to be a leader and no longer a follower in this whole question of certification. Just quickly, I don't want to go into too much detail about the technicalities of the certification system. Obviously, it needs some sort of standard for assessing the sustainability of forestry operations on the ground. It needs a standard for ensuring that linking the product in the marketplace back to a sustainable forest operation. And the key to our system, which makes it different from most other systems, is that the key standard for demonstrating sustainable forestry operations is this risk assessment standard, which is already in draft. And this sets out the methodology for a risk assessment at a jurisdictional level, which of course is the individual state in the United States. And instead of focusing on the individual forest management unit as the unit of certification, it defines that unit on the basis of a set of products, which will be hardwood logs, lumber and veneer, and the co-products from those mills. It's focusing just on low-intensity harvested forests within a specified jurisdiction, as I say, an individual state in the US. We're not looking to certify big public forest lands, big industrial plantations. We're very focused on a specific type of forestry, a specific range of products from a specified jurisdiction. And it sets out principles for legal and sustainable forestry, which are very much based, again, I have to emphasize, in some ways what we're doing is not particularly revolutionary. We're just building on the approach that we adopted with the Seneca Creek studies, originally back in 2008, 2017. We're simply making increasing the resolution of the risk assessments and putting those risk assessments within a framework which we believe will become an internationally recognized framework for risk assessment at jurisdictional level. The principles that we derived, they're comprehensive with respect to the other certification systems and respect with legality principles from a range of NGOs. We've done quite a lot of internal benchmarking as to how effective our system will be compared with other certification systems in meeting a whole range of principles. And it scores pretty highly, to be honest. It scores very highly because we are focusing on good governance within a particular jurisdiction. And actually, that's increasingly what procurement officials want. It's increasingly what buyers want, so that they can better conform with laws like the deforestation law and like EUTR. There's criteria, 14 criteria. We might add a 15th criteria, including a carbon measure in there, so we can start verifying the carbon content of products more effectively. And then the standard sets out indicators and assessment guidelines and the qualification requirements of risk assessment. So we have this in draft. The next stage is to get that standard endorsed. And this is a particularly critical stage. We need to set up a standards endorsement body. And this is where we're talking to people who have been previously involved with FSC, a guy called Richard Donovan, who might be familiar with you. It looks like he will chair that standards endorsement body. We need somebody who has long experience of certification, a real credible expert in this, and somebody who has a worldwide reputation in this topic. And he's very keen, actually, to act as the chair of that standards endorsement body. Once we've got the standards endorsed by the standards endorsement body, we can begin the process of undertaking risk assessments in line with the standards. They would have to be endorsed by another body, a risk assessment endorsement body that will be set up for the purpose. And at the same time, we've got a guy called Alistair McGregor, who used to run BM Charter, which was a big FSC and PFC chain of custody certification company. He is now drafting for us the chain of custody standard for this particular certification system, which we're calling the proof of sustainable hardwood proof of provenance standard. Just quickly to emphasize what this will mean for the individual mills. I have to emphasize this is voluntary, like all certification systems. It will only those mills that want to use the labels need to sign into this system. So it can be voluntarily applied by individual mills, distributors, and exporters. It closely parallels the Lacey due care type procedures, the EUTR due diligence system procedures, the FSC controlled wood, things like the SFI procurement system. It closely parallels those systems, but the idea is to be much simpler and much lower cost to implement because of the existence of these SHC approved state risk assessments. The hardwood that's entering the mill will be classified under the system as either sustainable or unspecified risk, depending on what the jurisdictional risk assessment has indicated. And we're saying that sustainable hardwood would be from either small forest holdings in jurisdictionals which have been specified low risk using the risk assessment standard, or it could be wood from other certification systems, FSC, SFI, or American Tree Farm System. We're not trying to compete with these. We're simply saying there's a gap in these certification systems. We can fill that gap with this jurisdictional risk assessment. And the primary processor will indeed have to undertake some mitigation actions, but that will be in pursuit of demonstrating that your entire supply base is sustainably produced, your entire output is sustainably harvested in line with procurement policies of your major customers. There will be a third-party audit of the chain of custody system, and here we're keen to work with the with associations within the hardwood sector in the US. We could perhaps develop some forms of group certification through the associations. And we hope, and we will achieve with the risk assessments, we should be able to achieve by the end of next year, for example, broad national coverage of all the hardwood producing states within a reasonable budget, which if we do that, there will be much less need for any form of physical segregation or volume credit systems that could, and not having to implement such strict systems of physical segregation and that sort of thing will, again, reduce the costs. And we want to explore opportunities created by new technology to reduce the costs even further. And here, there's quite a strong link with this organization, World Forest ID, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a consortium which is made up, actually, of the US Forest Service International Program, Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, the World Resources Institute, FSC is a part of that organization, and Agro Isolab, which is a scientific company based in the UK. And what they're trying to do, and what they are doing successfully, is applying modern technologies to identify the forest source of wood products. Particularly interesting for American hardwood sector is that they're already doing a lot of work on US hardwoods, and it looks like from the work that they've done that the stable isotope ratio analysis process will be particularly useful for US hardwoods. And they're already seeking, in fact, I think they've already got quite a lot of this money, $6 million over 3 years from the US government to do a wide-ranging study. I think they've got at least half that money already to set up a reference library of wood samples from 10 of the most traded US hardwood species from across the US growing regions. And once they've got this reference library, they'll be able to undertake a simple laboratory test on any hardwood, and they would be able to identify it by comparing the isotope content of that piece of wood. They would be able to identify its origin to a specific state, or even down to the individual forest inventory analysis, inventory unit. One of the principal reasons when the US government's supporting this is for enforcement reasons, of course, for Lacey enforcement action, but we think there's a real opportunity to use this level of good quality data in support of sustainability claims. We can make positive use of this data. There would be an immediate role of this data to monitor the new sustainable hardwood certification system. Its integrity could be checked just by random samples of labeled hardwood products in the market, wherever they may be in the world. We could do random checks of labeled products to identify if there's any misuse of the label. And in fact, chain of custody audits over time could be either ramped up or preferably down, depending on the extent of label misuse. And longer term, this is some way off, I have to be honest, it could make chain of custody systems obsolete, this sort of data, simply because we'd have new ways of identifying the origins of timber products back to the original jurisdiction where there would be a low risk through this sort of technology, but that is some way off, I have to confess. The details of this certification systems, the rationale for it, we've just launched a new website today. The address is there, and it sets out all the details that I've just explained now. It gives a bit more detail as to what the certification standards will contain, what we hope to achieve, what the market situation is for this thing. And particularly important, if you scroll down to the bottom of that website, you will find a link to a statement of support. And what we're really looking for at this stage is for individual companies within the US hardwood sector to download that statement of support, to indicate that you believe that this form of certification is important and will be useful to the growth of the industry. We're not asking for any money. We're not asking you to sign up specifically to getting certified at this stage. We just need your agreement that you believe this sort of approach to certification is the right one when you're dealing with low-intensity harvested hardwoods from non-industrial forest management units. The statement's there. I'm not going to go through it. It sets out the need and explains what you're actually signing up to. And that's essentially it. That's where we've got to, this QR code here. If you actually point your camera at that QR code now, you will be able to get a copy of the statement on your iPhone or whatever. You will be able to get one just now. So if you want to sign up to it, please do so. You can do it. You can do it today. Thank you very much.
As we said, we've been working on this for a while. We really do think this could work. At this point, what we're looking for is for the industry to put some support behind it. Again, not financially. We're not asking for anything other than to say we understand we need to do something in order to create a certification system, or in order to be able to communicate the sustainability of our products to policymakers, to retailers, and to other decision makers. Once we get enough on this end, and we see support on this end, the next move then, as I understand it, Rupert, would be to talk to the buyers and talk to retailers overseas and policymakers overseas, and try to move, to continue to move the ball forward. And I think with that, we're more than happy to open it up to questions. Of course, we'll also be around this afternoon and then this evening at the dinner as well, and happy to take questions one-on-one. But I would urge you to take a look at that website, and it'll answer, I think, a lot of your questions.
In here as industry. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dave Witten, Director of Exports for Bingaman and Son Lumber. We've been working on this for years, okay? We don't know what we're missing by not having a certification system that recognizes what we already do. And that's what these guys have been doing, using AHEC funds, USDA funds, to get this built. So this is going on behind the scenes. We've been working on this, Mike and Rupert. He gave this incredible presentation, but I mean, as you can tell, Rupert's a scientist, okay? I'm coming to you and speaking out as an industry member just like you. We're missing opportunities because we don't have something like this that we don't even know about, because they're not even asking us because we don't comply. So AHEC and previous board members have set this up and funded this, so it's not cost you a penny. And we're just asking now with this, what he asked us to go online on that new website and just put your company name on. Do you agree that we should continue to set up this program? Eventually, it's got to be spun out and be on its own as a nonprofit of some kind. But that's still a year or two away. What we need from you now is to come forward and say, yes, this is worth it. It's not going to cost you a penny. Just, does the industry support it? You folks are the most important party to this right now, because our customers overseas are wondering, well, is U.S. industry really behind this? USDA is wondering, is the U.S. industry really behind this? We need you. Please, go online. Read about this again, ask us questions again, and say, yes, it's worthwhile to continue to do this. And I, for one, and everyone that we've spoken to, and you know, I travel around the world a lot and talk to a lot of different people, and what we're saying here is really true. We need this as an industry, and it's going to benefit everybody, not just members. It's going to benefit everyone in the industry. and it's going to be very low cost. So I just had to jump in there and provide that. I hope I wasn't stepping on anybody's toes or anything, and I hope you all got the message. Please go online and just put your name and your company name down. Yes, continue to develop this. That's all we're asking. So are there any questions? Come on, somebody's got something. Did you hear that, Rupert?
No, you wouldn't need to record the origin of every single load. What we need is essentially you need to ensure that that the wood is coming from within the jurisdiction, so which can be a whole state. So it's multiple states, yeah. So I don't think you would need to record the origin of every single load. It would be simpler than that.
I can't see where you are, or who you are. Yeah. How many states do you take? Just give a number. 3 states. You would just be writing down, I am certifying that I take wood from these 3 states. And if you thought there were more, you would add more later on. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, because there will be a state risk assessment already available, the idea with the controlled wood, obviously, you have to undertake mitigation actions for the controlled wood in order just to make a claim with respect to quite a small proportion. I don't know how much of your woods, your sales are FSC, so you're having to undertake quite expensive and detailed mitigation actions to supply just a very small proportion of your wood as certified, which to me doesn't make any economic sense when actually the whole jurisdiction is low risk against all these principles. So we think we can demonstrate, and we're confident because we've already done some draft risk assessments, that we can underpin those claims against all the principles required in most procurement policies through this risk assessment, and you will be able to claim sustainable origin for your entire supply and export base. That's what we want to achieve without adding any costs to what you're already doing.
Yes, sir.
We are already required to pay a severance tax based on the county and state that they come out of. Why can't those records be used?
Can you explain more what that data is?
Every little loss comes in about some solvent. I have to document where it came from, the county that it came from, and the state that it came out of, and then pay a severance tax to either the state of Alabama, state of Mississippi, state of Tennessee. And we're already doing that, so you really already have the information there. And I'm not sure why we aren't using that information already.
Well, that's a great idea. I mean, that's the sort of thing we want to come out with from discussions with guys like you. In fact, one of the things we're wanting is the guy who's developing the chain of custody standard to talk directly to members, because it's so important that you are directly engaged in the development of the chain of custody standard. I think with the other programs, you get something imposed on you from the outside by people who don't understand your specific industry. And we're trying to develop a chain of custody standard that applies directly to your operations so that it's much cheaper, more effective, and better targeted. And I think there's an opportunity to do that now.
So to answer your question briefly would be, yes, we would want that data and use it to prove what's happened.
And that would show that what jurisdiction it's coming from.
And that would be the proof.
What's an unsustainable forest?
Well, okay, here in the U.S., We don't know what that means. But when you travel around the rest of the world, you sure find out. And what Europe is trying to do, and the UK is trying to do, is say, we want to buy only what's sustainable. We take it for granted because we have the best hardwood resource in the world. We don't even know what's unsustainable. But in the rest of the world, it's unsustainable. Dean.
Being that this is all AHEC funded, how is this going to be able to roll out to the industry? Is this going to be strictly for export? Because I'm familiar with what AHEC dollars can go. Address that.
Mike.
That's going to be part of the long-term decisions that we're going to that the industry is going to have to make. And at the end of the day, it's going to be up to the industry whether or not this is worthwhile. We're in the fortunate position that we're able to do a lot of this groundwork and do these risk assessments using USDA funds. But again, as part of that with the USDA funds, that's why making sure that the industry is engaged and going on and filling out that form, I think is going to be critical, because otherwise the USDA is going to say, why are we going to pay money into something that the industry is not supporting? Eventually, it would have to be rolled out, but that would be, I think, probably a couple years down the road. And in the meantime, even if we're doing nothing with the AHEC funds other than those individual state risk assessments, at the end of the day, that's a pretty good deliverable. And if we decide as an industry that that's as far as we want to take it, that's really up, that's really up to the industry. We're fortunate that we do have access to these funds. We're hoping, and I know Dana Cole has been talking, and there was today there was a marker put forth by a bipartisan group of senators to actually double the funding for the programs that we use, MAP and FMD. So there is a possibility that we could have significantly more funds to develop something like this moving forward. But once we get the pieces in place, then there's going to have to be some kind of an oversight, and how that works out is something that, as an industry, we're going to need to decide whether that goes through other associations, whether you have group certification through this, through NHLA or through AHMI or something like that. I mean, there's a number of options, and obviously right now we don't have all of the answers to all of those details.
So all that background can be done with
Yes.
funding.
Yep.
The industry can choose how to use that.
The industry can choose how to use that. Correct.
Exactly. These lights, I can't hardly see anyway. Go ahead.
You mentioned something about Mexico, and it looked like in the future it could be a hot spot. If it's the case, do you see that the growth would be as an investment closer to the border or throughout the country of Mexico where these companies might be setting up?
Well, I think where we're looking at the nearshoring, we'd probably be looking at closer to the border for a lot of it. Although the big hub of the Mexican furniture industry is in and around Guadalajara, there's quite a bit that's focused on the maquiladora sector that's focused on exports into the U.S. So there'll be a mix, but a lot of it that are looking at exporting their furniture or whatever they're manufacturing back to the U.S. A lot of that will take place near the border.
So we'll just add to that, Tom, if you don't mind, that what we're doing with AHEC is for exports. And as you mentioned, that's a great program, and it's quite similar. So if you're a member of that already and using that domestically, the very basics are similar to what we're talking about. That's going to suffice what our overseas customers require. And so, you know, I think, as was mentioned over here, our company is FSC certified too. And the buyers are only going off the list of who's FSC. So if you're not FSC, you're not even getting that inquiry. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We don't know what we're missing when we're not applying or following the guidelines that our customers overseas are requiring.
Yeah, and the principle here, we wouldn't want to disrupt Tom's program at all. I think it's a great program. And what we would be doing is actually using basically the same sort of systems and underpinning it with the data. It's already there, and actually the forest owners are already managing sustainably. It's just a matter of providing data against all the principles of sustainability in all these procurement policies, which are lengthy lists, as you know, and ensuring that data is packaged in a way that could boost that certificate to a level that is recognized in international markets. That's what we're trying to achieve.
Any other questions or comments? We don't want to quit too early. This is a big issue. It's something pretty detailed to wrap your heads around. But could, yes, sir. Sorry, I can't see.
Yeah, well, this is what we need. This is why actually we need you to sign this statement, because we've deliberately not been pushing this approach yet widely in the international market, in the European market. We haven't been raising expectations because we don't want to impose anything on you. We don't want to have anybody saying that we're actually coming here and saying we're imposing some sort of system on you. That's absolutely not what we're doing. We want you to sign in and say, yeah, this is a good approach. And if we can do that, at that point we can start going to the policymakers in Europe and saying, look, we've got a better system. And actually, your law, if you adapt it just in a small way, could help us build this better framework for demonstrating sustainability. If we can't say that, and if you're not going to buy into it, fine. We will find alternative ways of leveraging the EU. It might not be pretty, to be honest. We might be talking WTO cases and that sort of thing, because what they are doing is definitely against WTO rules from what we can say. But we really do not want to go down that route. It's quite a negative route. We certainly don't want to be seen as aligning with the likes of the Indonesian palm oil sector and objecting. We want to be able to go to them and say, yeah, this is a great law. We have a positive way of demonstrating conformance to this that we feel is a lot better, and it's a really positive law. We can support you implementing it. That's where we want to be in our lobbying efforts.
And I think that kind of answer your question, Joe. It's there's going to be a problem. I mean, there's two different versions right now, one in the Parliament, one in the EU Commission, that need to be reconciled, similar to what we do between the House and the Senate. The problem is both versions have the geolocation requirement in them. So the reconciliation process is not going to take care of this for us. But I think the Europeans, the policymakers, are going to be in for a bit of a shock of what the actual implications of this law, particularly on things like U.S. hardwoods. And if you look at the law as written, you would think this is going to be fantastic. You read the preamble, and it's talking about the need to protect small landowners and small forestry operations, and to stop the conversion of forest land into palm oil plantations or soybean plantations and that sort of thing. It should be really good for us. And actually, just a very small change to the wording on that could make a lot of that go away. I mean, just change jurisdiction, to a specific state, for example, instead of to the individual real estate holder, the individual landowner. I mean, that's what's not going to be workable for us. Like Rupert said, I think it would be a WTO case. There's no such thing as a simple WTO case. They're very expensive to litigate, but I think what Rupert was alluding to, also the optics would not be good. You know, the U.S. hardwood industry is out here fighting in the WTO because we're against anti-deforestation legislation. You know, that doesn't really jive with our messaging and with our industry. So what we're trying to do is avoid, you know, that type, I don't want to say nuclear option with Putin's talking about lately, but you know, that's really what we're trying to avoid. It would, yeah, this, as it stands right now, this would be implemented January 1st of 2024, the EU requirement. And now, one of the ways the U.S. soybean industry, for example, has set up exactly this, a jurisdictional certification system that the European Union has accepted already under this new law, as has the biofuel industry in the United States, the wood pellet industry, has also set up a jurisdictional risk assessment, actually using some of our, the Seneca Creek study to justify it. And the European Union has accepted that as well. But they don't seem willing to accept that for solid wood coming, that's not going to be burned immediately, coming out of the same forest as those wood pellets. And you know, that's a problem. And at the very least, if we get no further than getting the risk assessments, but kind of shining a light on that issue and on that hypocrisy, I think it's you know, it's a step in the right direction.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yes, we'll be emailing this link to all of the AHEC members, and please, if you're working with other mills that aren't AHEC members, let them know what's going on as well, and feel free to forward it. The more the industry that's involved and understands what's going on, the better it is.
How about to all of the associations, Mike, that
Yep.
we know? We could just ask all the association leaders. Yep. So it's not costing you a penny. It's going to open markets that we think are open to us now, but they really aren't, and they're going to start closing down if we don't get ahead of this. And if we do have a list of companies, hundreds of American companies that are saying, yes, online I've signed to say, please continue to develop that. That's all we're asking right now. Then we can go to the EU or to anyone and say, hey, we're working on this, we're getting it. You know, it's not going to happen until January 1st of 2024 in a perfect scenario, but we're getting there. Then they might say, yeah, okay.
And as David mentioned, what we're looking at too is, you know, getting the support on this end that the industry's behind it, but at the same time, we're talking to not only policymakers, but to retailers, to architectural firms, and really trying to build the momentum, you know, both in the United States and in our customer base overseas. So that both sides are aware of it, because at the end of the day, too, particularly in Europe, it's, you know, if it's the European companies that are talking to the European government about, you know, this is a doable, you know, acceptable way for us to show, you know, to mitigate risk, to show the low risk, to show the legality and sustainability, this is going to help the European industries as well. And as I mentioned before, it goes beyond just Europe, because those furniture manufacturers and places that are selling wood furniture into Europe are going to have to deal with this exact same geolocation requirement.
I don't want to belabor it anymore. Comments, questions, more? Mike, how would you like to close?
Thank you.
Thank you all.